Hello, it's another rainy day here in London, so I thought rather than try to film where I normally do, where there's only natural light, which there isn't very much of today because it's very grey, I would come into my library and film a video in here. And I don't normally film in here because on the other side of this wall of books, there is another apartment where a family lives, and there's often lots of screaming coming through. Anyway, that's completely irrelevant to the point of this video, which is to talk about 30 different books to better help us understand the world. This is a list of books that I came across in an article on The Guardian, where they asked a group of experts in different fields to recommend some books to better understand these issues which have been dominating the headlines over the course of this past year, which is mainly to do with the climate crisis, gender, populism, big tech, pandemics, and race. These are the main issues I think that there's been a lot of political debate about, and which I would like to understand in a bit more depth. So I think these would be some really interesting suggestions to read over the course of the next few months. I've not read any of these books before, but also with it's sort of perfect timing with November coming up, and a lot of people participate in the month-long readathon known as Nonfiction November, and so there are some fictional choices in here, but there are some nonfiction as well. And me, as someone who mainly reads novels and fiction, I always look to lists like this for some nonfiction choices of good ones that I should get to. So I'd be really interested to know if you've read any of these, and if you would recommend them. Let me know in the comments below, or if you're just interested in reading any of these, which of these sound the most interesting to you. First is For Small Creatures Such as We by Sasha Sagan. This is described as part memoir, part guidebook, and part social history, looking at the everyday wonders in life through the eyes of science. And Sasha Sagan is the daughter of Anne Druyan, who's an activist and a documentary producer, and Carl Sagan, who's a famous astronomer and cosmologist. And I read a lot of Carl Sagan when I was younger, and he was one of the first authors that got me really excited about space and outer space, and the whole science of outer space, and the wonder of outer space. Like I'm a secret outer space sort of geek. I love reading nonfiction books about it and watching documentaries about it, and so I think it'll be really interesting hearing or reading about her upbringing with some great figures, like this, and how they influenced how she sees the world. Next is a science fiction novel that was just published this year called The Ministry for the Future by Kim Stanley Robinson. And as I've been talking about recently, I've been getting into reading more science fiction, and I really like the twist of this novel, which is set in the near future, and rather than setting a sort of dystopian landscape, it considers all of the environmental threats that we're currently facing and possible ways that we can overcome them. So it's a slightly more upbeat look about how a utopian future maybe isn't out of reach. All We Can Save: Truth, Courage, and Solutions for the Climate Crisis. This is a collection of essays written by more than 60 women who describe how women and girls are at greater risk of displacement or death due to extreme weather disasters. So this group of essays really focuses on that different perspective. The Great Derangement by Amitav Ghosh. This is a writer who's written a lot of novels, but this is a book of nonfiction where he considers how future generations will probably look back at us as slightly deranged for not realizing and fully embracing the scale that the climate crisis is causing to our planet. So the book is a call to action for how we can enact change and tackle these issues which we're facing in our time. Resetting Our Future: What If Solving the Climate Crisis is Simple by Tom Bowman. I think when thinking about climate change, the issue seems so large and unmanageable that it sort of feels like there's nothing we can do about it. And so he suggests in this book that it's not a question of science or having the ability to, enact change. It's more about the social and political will to actually, make that change happen, which so he's trying to reframe our ideas about that and show what we can actually do to enable these changes. What is Populism by Jan-Werner Müller? This is a book which seeks to define what contemporary authoritarian populism is. That is, leaders that present themselves as if they represent the will of the entire population, and if they gain political power, then they can undermine democratic norms and institutions and make out that anyone who opposes them are traitors. So it's a way of sort of consolidating their power. And, I can think of quite a few leaders who sort of fit this mold of populism. The People versus Democracy, Why Our Freedom is in Danger and How to Save It by Yascha Mounk. This is about two issues. It's about a democracy without rights. So sort of living under a democracy where we don't have all the human rights that we ought to have under such a system, and also rights without democracy, looking at technology and how the online world is sort of dominating these issues and steering our opinions for it rather than allowing us to have a conversation and debate about it ourselves. So it's a way of looking at how we can rejuvenate democracy and enact economic and cultural changes so that we can, better have our opinions represented by the political figures who lead us. How Democracies Die by Stephen Levitsky and Daniel Ziblatt. So this is looking at recent American political history and how there's a growing suspicion about the media and election results, which leads to a breakdown in mutual tolerance between different political parties. So it's sort of explaining how if there's a tolerance and respect for oppositional political parties and different political platforms, this actually strengthens democracy. So it's trying to show how it's better to have a conversation between political parties, rather than seeing each other as an opposition which can't be tolerated. Ruling the Void, The Hollowing Out of Western Democracy by Peter Mair. This was published back in 2013, but it sort of anticipated how in Europe and in the United States there would be the rise of these populist political leaders who aren't really so interested in democratic debate, but more establishing themselves as the absolute political leaders that must be followed without any opposition. So it describes the real importance of political participation and democratic debate. Post-Communist Mafia State, The Case of Hungary by Bálint Magyar. This looks at how authoritarian populism is often very associated with corruption, and so it looks at the recent history of politics in the country of Hungary and how this sort of worked. And because the authoritarian leaders had such strong links with the inspectors and courts and media, it meant it had this controlling influence over the country, and it ended not only democracy within the country, but free trade within it as well. And so it forms the emergence of a mafia-like oligarchy, and it considers not only how these states can rise, but also how they can end. Think Like a White Man by Dr. Booley Whitelaw III, as told by Nels Abbey. So this is an exploration of current racial politics and also a social commentary and also a satire. So I think it's a funny and engaging way of looking at racial politics from an entirely different perspective. Brit-ish on Race, Identity and Belonging by Afua Hirsch, who was one of the judges of the Booker Prize last year. So this is a memoir, but also a social history of recent times, looking at race and identity through a journalistic eye. So it's very personal, but is also a survey on modern history and popular culture. The Good Immigrant USA. So I have read some of these essays when this was first published last year, but this list sort of reminded me that I need to go back and read more of these. So I'd read the first book of this anthology, which was just called The Good Immigrant, which was focusing on the voices of different UK BAME individuals. And so this looks at a number of different writers and personalities from the United States, from different minority groups, and looks at these many different issues of to do with identity and politics from their own personal perspective. I Am Not Your Baby Mother by Candace Braithwaite. This book starts with the very startling fact that Black British women are 5 times more likely to die during childbirth than their white counterparts. So that's a very upsetting fact, and it's part memoir and it's part social commentary looking at this issue. And it considers the biases and racial prejudices that are entrenched in various institutions in current British society. Natives, Race and Class in the Ruins of Empire by Akala. This looks at the mythology around the British Empire through an intersection between race and class, and about the realities of growing up Black and British today within these imperial shadows. Men Who Hate Women by Laura Bates. This is looking at misogyny in online culture today through a series of interviews with people, and also examining, the broad spectrum of misogyny that's really openly shown in online conversation today, and how this can lead to a lot of the new male generation being absolutely resistant to even the discussion of sexism at all. In the Dark Room by Susan Faludi. This is a sort of memoir about the author's father, who was born with the name Istvan, then changed his name to Stephen, and eventually died with the name Stephanie. So it's about the father's evolving sense of identity over the past, how this was influenced and changed by politics of the time through the Nazi era up into living in America, and then through to returning to her home in Eastern Europe. It sounds like such an amazing history through a very personal perspective. Invisible Women by Caroline Criado Perez. This book is a sort of updating of Simone de Beauvoir's landmark book, The Second Sex, which looked at how there were many cultural codes designating women as others. So it sort of updates this by looking at how this manifests both online and in the physical world in our current culture. Loud Black Girls. This is a collection of essays which give a very personal perspective on what it means to be young, Black, British, and female in the world today, by considering many different fears, obsessions, and systems of belief. How Not to Be a Boy by Robert Webb. This is a memoir by the famous TV personality whose debut novel I just read really recently, and this is an exploration of masculinity and his own personal experiences with it through his addiction with alcohol, his flirtation with bisexuality, and the importance of male friendship in his life. The Black Death by Ol Benedictau. This is a book which is a complete history of the worst pandemic in human history, which took place between 1346 and 1353, and how the author estimates that approximately 60% of the European population was wiped out from this pandemic. So this is based on current figures and research, so is meant to be the most up-to-date and current history of this pandemic. 28 Stories of AIDS in Africa by Stephanie Nolan. So quite often books will only focus on the effects that AIDS has in the United States or maybe Europe, but this book focuses on 28 different accounts of individuals within African countries that have been personally affected by the AIDS crisis, and especially how the politics and society and culture will really shape how AIDS manifests within these different countries. The Pull of the Stars by Emma Donoghue. This is a novel I've been really wanting to get to, which focuses on the Spanish flu of 1918, and it's the story of a flu-ridden maternity ward of a hospital in Dublin during that time, and how women who were pregnant were particularly susceptible to this. So it looks on the effects of that and the tragedies of that, in comparison to the First World War. The Rules of Contagion by Adam Kucharski. This looks at the history of pandemics and how societies respond to them, and how the spread of misinformation can be just as deadly as the spread of the viruses themselves. And so this book tries to show how we can get better at predicting of what happens next when a pandemic occurs. Sulfuric Utopias by Lucas Engelman and Christos Linteris. So this is a book which looks at the history of maritime practices, of disease management and control, and how in the 20th century new fumigation techniques created a utopian vision of disease-free global trade, which obviously hasn't worked out. Steve Jobs by Walter Isaacson. This is a biography about a man who obviously revolutionized so much about our modern technology and how we use computers. And this is by a man who worked with Steve Jobs, so obviously knew him very intimately, and Jobs cooperated with this biography being written of him, but he didn't put any limits on what was being said or what material could be used. I don't know if I believe that makes it really an objective account of this man's life, but it's a very interesting and comprehensive one because it's over 600 pages long. The Nature of Technology, What It Is and How It Evolves by W. Brian Arthur. This looks at the origins and the evolution of technology through the ages, and suggests that rather than there just being these big light bulb moments when a new technology is founded, that they're unrelated different developments which come together to form something entirely new. Reengineering Humanity by Brett Frischman and Evan Selinger. So this book gives a different perspective that maybe technology isn't here to serve humanity, but we're here to serve technology, or rather it isn't so much the rise of smart technology, but rather the dumbing down of humanity. Human Compatible, Artificial Intelligence and the Problem of Control by Stuart Russell. So there have been a lot of dystopian fictional books about the rise of artificial technology and how it's going to control all of our lives, but this is an account from somebody who's a leading expert on creating new artificial technology, and he points out some of the warnings about how some of this AI technology really does pose a threat to our humanity in many different ways. The Age of Surveillance Capitalism by Shoshana Zuboff. This is a book that shows how capitalism morphed to exploit the conditions of our new digital age, and how it's a new economic order that claims human experience as free raw material for hidden commercial practices of extraction, prediction, and sales. So it shows how our minds and our behavior are being exploited by these capitalist institutions through the means of this new technology. So those are the 30 books on the list. Quite a lot of them sound really interesting, and I think it'll be, a way of sort of differently engaging with a lot of these big issues rather than just turning my back and, sort of pretending they don't exist and not wanting to think about them, which is, it's quite often I feel more inclined that way. But like I said, let me know if you've read any of these and would especially recommend them. Let me know in the comments below, or if you're really interested in reading any of these now, or if you have any other suggestions of current or recent books that really engage with a lot of the big issues that we've been facing this year. So thank you for watching, and I'll speak to you again soon. Bye.